All right, so we're here with another episode of Playing with Research in Health and Physical Education. We have a superstar group inside this office here today. We're here to talk about the future research in physical education. And this specific article was published in Research Quarterly for Exercise and Sport just a few weeks ago, maybe this week, 2019. So it's titled Exploring Future Research in Physical Education, Espousing a Social Justice Perspective. And we have Jennifer Walton Fissette in here, Kevin Andrew Richards in here, Erin Centeio in this room as well, and then the other co-authors are Todd Pennington and Tim Hopper. So let me just kind of start off and, we all kind of have heard about this 50 million strong campaign by 2029 from Shape America. And, the specific, and I'm quoting Shape America here, to prepare all children to lead active and healthy lives in these four interrelated areas: physical activity, healthy behaviors, positive health and physical education policies, and then health and physical education standards. And one of this part of this agenda Shape America has is that they've asked groups of scholars to work in collaborative teams to explore future research topics and questions intended to advance this goal of 50 million strong. So what a great honor to be asked to predict the future of research in physical education. I'm super happy to be in this room with you. So Jen, maybe you can start. What route did you choose? How is this paper structured? What was your kind of, when Shape America calls and says, hey, can you write this paper with this collaborative group?
So we met, it was all five of us, online, and honestly the only two things that we knew really were it had to connect to 50 million strong and it had to connect to the adapted social ecological framework.
Mm-hmm.
And then this idea of physical education was our focus and what would be like the future research that we need in physical education. And I don't even remember exactly how we got on the social justice topic, but I'm very passionate about it. It's where my research area is, where my pedagogy focuses on. And so I came from a social justice perspective just in our conversation, and it was pretty remarkable that everybody very quickly just bought into, yes, like social justice is so important. Social justice is lacking, and really we thought that that would just be a component of an area of where we needed to focus on research. But the whole group collectively agreed that this needs to frame our entire paper, and that no matter what areas that we say that we need to have future research, that it has to have this connection to social justice, because that should be really driving and leading our field. And with the 50 million strong campaign, with our current standards and policies that we have, it's not only not leading, there's a paucity of it.
Yeah. So maybe you can give us an update of, I know you've done a lot of presentations on this and published on this, but what's the status of social justice education in the U.S. PEAT system? Like, are we as teacher educators doing a good job overall in teaching social justice to the future teachers who are then implementing this?
So if I said no, that would be too simple, right? We need to expand on that. It's very limited. And so actually a paper that I did on the podcast earlier from the PESP special issue that came out in September 2018, that holistic special issue really was international. But when you tease that out and you look at the U.S., that we're not teaching for or about social justice in our PEAT programs at all, or very limited. And if we are doing it, it's more with teachable moments. So it's not intentional and it's not explicit. So basically it's not planned. It's not, the forefront of what we're teaching our pre-service teachers. And so there's a lack of it in our PEAT programs.
Okay. And then you cite in here, you say that physical education is a social justice issue. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, that's a loaded statement, and I think that we'd be here all day if we really looked at what physical education is a social justice issue. We know that physical education is a very public space. We don't address that. It's not part of our standards. We don't address how hegemonic, white, masculine our field has been for decades upon decades. The very traditional physical education is how it has been, and our world is changing with our student population, with who we are as PEATs. but none of that is being explored at all. And so social justice is permeates all of physical education, but we can continue to turn our heads and not want to address it. We just don't.
Yeah.
And so that alone is an issue in itself.
Yeah. And I'm acknowledging that I'm a white male in physical education asking you these questions as well. So you said that, social justice should be in the national standards. Mm-hmm. Is it not now? And what would it look like if it was done in a way that you are proposing?
So that actually connects to what I just presented on, actually. And so right now, if you take our initial PEAT standards, and this is a cursory, I shouldn't say a cursory look, it is trying to connect anything little that deals with anything cultural issues, social justice issues, sociocultural. Of the 25 outcomes for the PEAT standards, 6 you could tangibly say has anything related to social justice. The K through 12 standards, there's 171 outcomes across elementary, middle school, and high school. 8 tangibly connect to something that says diverse student needs or something cultural oriented. It is not explicit, it is not overt, and if we don't make it explicit and overt, PE teachers are not going to teach for and about social justice. So unless there's either an explicit standard. We know what the 5 standards are here in the U.S. If there's an explicit standard that is about critical inquiry and social justice, then it'll be more explicit. Or, as we did with this paper, if it's an overarching over all of the standards and there's a critical social justice connection with each of the standards, that would make it much more overt. So then teachers would be like, this is important and I need to teach for and about social justice and critical inquiry, and it's not there.
And I'm even thinking, how many times when it says diverse student needs, are they relating to adapted physical education and disability and not actually thinking about other types of diverse students? So
you are exactly right. In higher, low skilled, and where are there in any of our standards, do they say anything about gender, sexuality, religion, etc.? That's not there. And so right, what does diverse mean? How do they interpret that is a very good question.
Yeah. So you specifically articulate connections between social justice education and 4 key interconnected research areas related to A, occupational socialization, B, curriculum, instruction, and assessment, C, technology, and D, professional development. So maybe you can go through these one by one and have Kevin and Erin kind of jump in here as well. So why don't we start with occupational socialization as one of the fields?
If I could just take a moment of liberty. Jen touched on. Thank you. Jen touched on this at the beginning, but I think one of the cool things about these podcasts is that you're able to kind of see under the hood a little bit with how papers come together that you might not be able to get just at face value reading the paper. And like Jen said, we had a series of initial conversations, and I was actually a little bit nervous at first that we were going to have a hard time coming together and finding a way to frame this. We have 5 different people, each with fairly different research traditions and backgrounds, but the kind of push towards social justice came right away, and everybody was like, yeah, totally good with that. Because originally we had talked about having social justice as one of maybe like 4 or 5 areas, but as we started to play around with it a little bit more, it felt like social justice was really this guiding framework, and then the 4 areas that we settled on, you just mentioned, all tied back to social justice. So when we talk about occupational socialization, which is where I'll start here, the focus there is in relation to social justice. So how do we promote socialization experiences that challenge rather than reproduce the status quo in our teachers, and help them to develop, espouse, and teach with a social justice pedagogical skill set, belief system, etc. And that begins with the recruitment process, right? So how do we recruit more diverse groups of students into our PEAT programs? Diversity in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation or identity, and then also other things like physical activity preference. We tend to recruit a lot of students into our programs who have these team sport backgrounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how can we get more students into our programs that maybe have backgrounds in dance or gymnastics or non-traditional sports, recreational activities, so that they're coming in with these belief systems that more align with the students that they're going to end up seeing in their classes when they go out and teach. Most teachers in physical education, at least I would argue, are male. They're white, and they come from team sport backgrounds, and that's just not in line with the demographics that they're going to see when they go out to teach. So they need to be prepared to understand that their identity is not necessarily the right or the only identity to have. And then once we get them into these programs, into our PEAT programs, how do we develop content and pedagogical experiences within PEAT that help them to understand social justice, practice working in diverse communities, question assumptions about the subjective theories or belief structures they develop through their own socialization experiences in K-12 schools, so that they're better prepared to step out into diverse schools in the United States and be able to meet the needs of students who may not look like them, act like them, or have backgrounds that they have. And then, once they're in those schools, what kind of experiences can we structure so that they have the supports and the systems in place that they're able to teach for social justice in a meaningful way. And I actually, the way that this section's written, I'm going to finish with actually the first thing that we address, which is doctoral education.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're going to have PEAT programs that are teaching towards social justice and going beyond just the one stereotypical social justice class or multicultural education class that some of our universities have, and really take an embedded approach to teaching social justice across the curriculum, then PEAT faculty need to be prepared for that. And so how can we position doctoral education to best lead them in that way, so that when they finish their doctoral degrees, they're on board with social justice and they're prepared to do that within their courses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you bring up some good topics, and I know that people who are interested more in occupational socialization as a theory,
There's another podcast.
You did another podcast on that, and I think it's really important to look at it from all different levels, and it's insightful for us as professors looking inward, going, oh, do I do this well enough? And am I? And I'm disappointed, Jen, that I messed up on the audio in our great conversation before about how, as a white male, do I talk about race and gender issues, where I should be talking about it in my PEAT classes, but I don't know how to do it properly. And we had a great back and forth, and we can recreate that one day again.
But your point there is really good, though, Risto, and this was an amazing experience for me going through this process and learning with Jen and with everybody else on our team. I think that I'm somebody who tries to be attentive to social justice issues. I care about that, but I wasn't trained to do that necessarily, and it isn't, at least to this point in my career, a strong focus of my research agenda. But this experience really opened my eyes and doors for me in terms of maybe what I might think about doing in the future.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, people look at me right now as one of the experts or leaders in social justice, at least in the U.S. But it's not like I was trained. I was not occupationally socialized into social justice. It's learned, and I learned so much from my colleagues, which is why I like to go to conferences that really do have a social justice perspective, because I'm still learning too. No one has all the answers, or that's part of social justice. It's always about change and questioning and learning more.
Yeah. And I do like that there's a space, especially in ISEP, and we've had it in
ARA,
colleges, ARA, that are really good, and you see a lot of that research coming through. So let's move to the second part: curriculum, instruction, and assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Risto. So I think that, when we look at all of the literature around physical education, curriculum, instruction, and assessment is researched so much for generations. And This section really like overviews very, very briefly some of that research that has been done and just kind of points out where that research has been. And I think in our conversations, like we kind of created these research questions around curriculum instruction and assessment to really take this social justice stance and look more into it. Because as everyone's been alluding to, like we, need to prepare our teachers in all of these aspects to teach all different types of students. And even as teacher educators, like thinking about that and how we teach all of our different kinds of students, right? So within this section, we talked about curriculum and the different model-based approaches that have been developed over the years. And in regards to curriculum, we really thought about like the research question of how do we effectively teach social justice and successfully incorporate models-based practice in physical education. And additionally, then how does social justice really fit within the design and implementation of each of those pedagogical models? Because oftentimes we see like, oh, there's a social justice like model and we can teach it within that model, or social justice agenda might fit within TPSR. But really what we want to know is how does this fit throughout all of model-based instruction, and how can we really incorporate it into all of curriculum that we use within our teaching.
And I'm thinking Katie Fitzpatrick's keynote earlier today. I'm like, bells are going off in my head about how she listed those three separate parts, and how, exactly what you were writing about is how, how do you figure out into that model space practice, and that it's not separate from social justice, that it's flowing through.
So then the second part is about instruction and really like teaching for learning approach and implementing these model-based approaches, because it's one thing to like know them and understand them, but then how do we go and implement them? And so the second research question was, how do we teach pre-service teachers and in-service teachers to consider the socio-cultural context of their own programs, and then use this knowledge to really choose a pedagogical model that best aligns with their program goals? And so really kind of focusing on that instruction with all different students. And then the assessment piece is a little bit different, because assessment in and of itself, and we've had these conversations, can really marginalize students itself, right? And so how can PEAT programs really prepare pre-service teachers on assessment literacy, and how to really consider social-cultural context and students' social identities when developing and implementing assessments within their teaching practices.
Okay.
So then the next section of the paper, I'll just go ahead and kind of move on to that, is technology. And when we think about technology in physical education, there's a big push in the US to incorporate technology in education in general, and physical education is really not excluded from that. But when we think about technology, sometimes it is enabling for students, like they learn a lot through technology, but sometimes it also marginalizes students as well, just because of availability of technology. So the chapter kind of talks a little bit about what technology is that has been researched and used in physical education, and then we kind of came up with 3 questions around technology. So the first one was, what challenges do physical education teachers encounter when implementing digital technologies into their curriculum? And then how are these digital technologies used to promote student learning by using more inclusive and participatory pedagogies? The second research question that we thought was really important was, how can teacher education programs model the use of pedagogical content knowledge to enable the next generation of physical educators to effectively integrate digital technologies within their pedagogical content knowledge, while still promoting diverse and inclusive learning experiences for all students? And then the last one was, how can physical educators use digital technologies to really enhance students' learning while guiding them through these critically spaces, and how do we interpret oppressive messages and help them resist these messages promoted by corporate interests that control the use of the data and educational purposes.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the critical media literacy is super important in learning. You know, I went to a couple of sessions here on body image and how, you know, where else do we talk about that? Physical education can be that space to learn about how social media, which is a digital technology, and how we're embodying those, you know, pictures and messages and images to make us feel bad about ourselves, right? And so I think, you know, having that as a conversation topic is going to be huge going forward.
And looking at it from a critical perspective, because actually one of the outcomes of the K-12 Shape America standards is about idealized body image, but it doesn't talk about the critical perspective of that. How do you critique these social media messages that they're getting? How do you critique the images that they're seeing or these ideals that they have? That critical aspect is lost, which is why this is so important to connect with technology and with social justice.
Yeah. And so the final section was on professional development, and I think we should say at this point, you know, that I took the lead on the occupational socialization section. Erin took the lead on the curriculum and instruction section, and then Tim and Todd Pennington each led the technology and professional development sections respectively. So, you know, the section that Erin just went over and the one on professional development are two that, you know, they're not here so they can't speak to it, but wanted to take a minute to acknowledge their work and their contributions. But so thinking about professional development, we teased that out from occupational socialization theory on purpose. In some of the work that I've done previously, sometimes, you know, we talk about professional development through a socialization lens. But here we wanted to be intentional to tease that out so that we highlighted it and then it could stand on its own. But we essentially looked at both in-service teacher professional development and PEAT faculty professional development. So how can in-service teachers, to start with, continue to learn to address social justice in their practice with the understanding that social ecologies in our country continue to change, and the world 20 years from now is not going to look the way it does right now. And so if newly qualified teachers continue to teach the same way that they do now for the next 20 years, eventually they're going to get to a point of what Hal Lawson called knowledge obsolescence back in the early 90s, which what they're doing is no longer relevant to the students that are in front of them in their classes. And so the first question that we had there then was how can in-service teachers gain knowledge about teaching for social justice and the pedagogical skills necessary to do so effectively through professional development. The flip side of this now, though, is that yes, we need to focus on professional development for in-service teachers, but we had a symposium earlier today on professional development for PEAT faculty members, and that's an area that I don't know that we talk about quite as much. You know, we do a lot of talking about how in-service teachers should access professional development, but we don't really think quite as much, at least not explicitly in our writing, about how we can also address continuing professional development for PEAT faculty. And we were talking about the socialization section a few minutes ago. You know, one of the points that I was trying to make was that doctoral students need to be prepared for a social justice agenda, but we already have PEAT faculty in the field, and then again, the social ecologies are going to continue to change, so PEAT students in 20 years aren't going to look the same as they do now. So how can we as PEAT faculty members continue to stay current through professional development opportunities? And so the question here was, how can PEAT faculty members receiving physical education continuous professional development in relation to their practice as teacher educators, and what is their capacity to promote social justice pedagogies in their PEAT programs?
Awesome. So what are some concluding thoughts kind of bringing this all together?
Well, first you have to note that even though we talked about these as 4 separate entities, they're so interrelated, and that was really difficult to tease out, to keep them into their little isolated boxes and categories, but they're very interrelated. And the importance of social justice, to be explicit and intentional, is just so critical. It's critical in our teaching, it's critical in our scholarship, and it's this whole full cycle which gets to the whole occupational socialization, because if we know that for a lot of students, our pre-service teachers, their socialization that through K through 12 schools really influences them even a lot more than their pre-service programs. And so until we start creating change with our doctoral programs, with us as PEAT faculty, it's not going to change K through 12. And that's the whole cycle that Kevin talks so much about. So that's one level, and then the other level is, unless we're explicit and intentional in our standards and policies, and this is where the connection to SHAPE and connection to 50 million strong happens, change is not going to happen, because we live in a standards-based education era in the US. Like, we've been doing that for decades now, and we haven't changed. I don't foresee that changing anytime soon. So if you're going to play the game of standards, then social justice has to be an explicit part of it, or else it's not going to change, because we teach for the standards, teach about the standards. So social justice has to be the leader of that.
I think one of the challenges with the standards-based agenda is that standards, by definition, define what is to be included in content, and as a result, things that aren't included in standards are not part of the content. Now, I think what you see sometimes is you have faculty members at specific institutions who are very passionate about a particular area, like social justice. So I'm sure that people like Jen and like Sarah Flory integrate social justice into their PEAT, despite the fact that the standards aren't explicit about doing that. They go above and beyond. But for other faculty members who maybe this isn't their area, or they don't feel as passionate about it, or they don't feel as prepared to do it, or they feel like they don't have the curriculum space, it's hard to fit everything in.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. The article, again, can be found in Research Quarterly for Exercise and Sport. We'll cite it here so you can look in the notes. We'll put on all your social media on there as well, so people can just look at the notes and find some information. But thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.